Welcome. Here we are today with Kofi Oduro. Kofi is an artist whose work cuts across poetry, code, video, music production, and so much more. His most recent project was funded by the CBC and the Canada Council, is an ambient audiovisual album combining performance, code, video, poetry, but also weaving, which is really interesting, I think. Kofi worked on a lot of different projects during the Digital Economies Lab, but in particular focused on the offer need machine, which is an interesting project focusing on and thinking through ideas of generous exchange and mutual care. Welcome, Kofi. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
Yeah, good.
1 week more till I'm out of this 5 month partial experiment, I want to say at times, of being in curfew. So now
You
May
can count
May
months? That's
28th.
impressive. I think I lost track of everything. It's
Yeah,
just
like
time
it,
soup.
it it was one of those things. Sort of had a norm within it, which is something we're probably going to touch on later on. But it made things more peculiar, and I don't want to say interesting. In like, there's interesting, and it was more of the latter.
So let's get right into talking about the Digital Economies Lab and your experiences here and some of the ideas that have emerged for you. Um, Maybe let's just start with the what interested you in the Digital Economies Lab and how your experience has been. I know we threw a lot of buzzwords in the opening and to sort of attract ideas around technology, but that's actually been a really interesting part. A lot of people in the DEL kind of zigged against the zag of our technology-focused elements. What interested you and how has that experience been?
Well, coming from like, because the thing is that when it comes to my art form, what a lot of people think is that I started with creative coding. So what happened is before the creative coding, where I mix music and animation and different things, part of my art form is that I did video editing and videography for a while. And even before then, I used to do a lot of spoken word freestyle poetry. So understanding that analog is still prevalent, even if you have digital artworks, was one thing that drew me in. And the buzzwords, of course, like blockchain and all that, which is now fundamental because if you watch recent news, you hear more about like crypto coins, volatility, how some coins are skyrocketing. And now, if you're into the digital art space, you might have been hearing about NFTs, which are really just art forms that are, or not necessarily just art. It could be anything that's on a blockchain. And a lot of artists are using this to try to see how they can have smart contracts, which allows artists to be paid and taught through the whole process. So when you're saying that people actually rebelled against technology, I find it interesting that the same discussions or the same thoughts of like artists union, this and that, are the same type of conversations that are being said in many online spaces. Because now during, because remember, Dell was right before the pandemic, so a lot of the things of like how artists are now having to use Zoom, having to use multiple platforms, is something that now is being echoed naturally due to a pandemic. And now,
Mm-hmm.
since more people are becoming digital, it's like, what does that mean for the artist? Like, now if you're a teacher or an artist, there's the joke that like, now if you're teaching an artist, now you're also a digital creator by choice. You probably have to set up all this tech stuff, probably have to know how to Zoom,
Yeah,
audio
I
level.
was
So
joking with my colleagues at the University of Ottawa, saying basically all courses, whether you're painting or sculpture, are actually media art courses now. So we just
yeah,
basically
but
have visual arts
right.
education.
But now we're talking, but what you just said is art changing medium. But now it's like, even if you teach in psychology or computer science on that, you have to make engaging content, because now it's almost like now cheat before, how people said YouTube University. Now with all these changes, you're directly competing with YouTube. Like, you're directly competing
Mm-hmm.
in, well, maybe not directly, but like there is a competition level of, okay, now you have to make engaging content, you have to know how to make a joke. So I think now teaching at university probably became a bit of an art form as well, more than ever.
Yeah, I basically, as a professor, I had to set up a feeling that I was setting up a YouTube channel, basically for my students. When you
Yeah.
when you think of what these changes, like in terms of how your experience has been, um, and how you've seen, the change over the course of the year that you were just referencing. Was it, playing with technology that attracted you to the program, and was that was it unexpected that you ended up in this project that was really about care in the way that it is?
Yeah, I think it is, but it's ironic because let's remember, I don't know if you remember my application form. Even though I was playing with technology, I remember for the questions, I actually never wrote a sentence. So I remember for everything, I actually wrote a poem.
Mm. Okay,
Like
yeah,
I
now
wrote
it's
a
coming
poem
back to me.
for every
Yeah.
single thing. That was like, because the story was that I'm like, okay, even though I'm technologist, you know what? I like poetry. This is how I express myself. So it's just funny that like even though I was brought to it in technology, like I still showed an analog art form to express myself. And even though I do creative coding, a lot of my stuff is based on traditional arts, right? Spoken word, music. Well, music is both digital and not digital, but it still has a very strong presence outside of the screen.
Mm-hmm.
What this pandemic and all this changes my assimilation to different platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And because like right now, like if we go on ONM, would have ONM comfort if it wasn't due to quarantine? Maybe not, because that is like the offer need machine.
Right.
It's another platform
Yeah.
that, if you think about it, is a platform that is trying to cater to a particular subset, not not of the population, but of a mood, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
we're trying to base it on care. We can name Twitter, Facebook, Zoom, Instagram,
Mm-hmm.
Gathertown. Every platform has a mood is trying to replicate.
Well, I think that there's something about the way, the foundational ideas of the O&M that were emerged even before the pandemic, of rethinking the idea of the network and trying to build different metaphors. What happened with the pandemic and the challenges to the cultural sector is you had a real strong organizing force for what needed to happen, and how do we make something that can foster care for the artistic community and create the kind of networks that are being severed in a whole bunch of ways. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you were thinking about care in relation to connecting artists' resources and all of this that's at the core of the O&M. How has that process been shaped by how you understand the idea of a platform and how you use platforms in your artistic practice?
Well, what was interesting is before I was in O&M, me and one of the other colleagues in the Dell, Swintac, we actually were trying to build experiences and all that. And then one thing that came to mind was that the problem with online stuff is that now if everything is done by an algorithm, the chances of something random happening does not occur. So we dubbed it the anti-Airbnb experience.
Mm.
Because I don't know if you remember, like before there was Airbnb, you guess what a hotel room looked like, because we know they do the photo shoots and whatnot. So you enter their hotel room, you did not know anything about it. Like you had to do a sweep. But now with Airbnb, it's not that Airbnb. So it's the same thing with like Spotify and all those. Like how we have playlists and curations and everything is almost an attack on like, oh wow, I didn't notice. A lot of your experiences are not random. Like you know exactly what you were going to get.
Mm.
And that's what one thing I was thinking. I'm like, how do we get that bond? Like, sometimes we don't like small talk, because small talk on the internet sometimes can be very tedious, but it is also needed, right? And it's an experience that I remember, because I remember when I wasn't driving my car, like taking a bus, even other people, like you're more likely going to meet a friend or meet someone you haven't seen in a while. But the more you drive, the less people you see. Then you have events, so it's like, oh wow, I haven't seen you in a blah. So now imagine when you take away events. A lot of people are not taking public transit, we're all home. Where do you get those random moments of spark?
Mm.
And because and this is where the platform idea, this is why when I came on O&M and doing many researches with like other colleagues from other projects like Mary Claire Flanagan, where we would experiment by going in different platforms and seeing what works or not. It's like Zoom is great, but Zoom is great for certain things. But now it's one of those things that like people think is the end all, where if let's say I need to share 5 screens at the same time, Discord might be better, or Jitsi because there's multiple screen shares. But this mentality comes from me being like okay, like a creative artist. But during the pandemic, I remember like the first 3 months, like last April, May, June, I was doing more consulting for my fellow peers. Like I remember one person like, what can I do to get an exhibition? And then I'm like, oh, maybe you can try this platform. It might not be perfect. And I remember we just went to like had to break down the walls of our perception to be like, okay, not everything's going to get the best thing. Or another person's like, okay, you know what? For your community, Discord might be better than Twitter because you can do X, Y, Z. And that's
Yeah.
like one of the nuances with this thing. Like if you ask me, it's like the thing about having that random interaction is that even your recommendations were more for people that understood you. Whereas I feel on the internet, like anyone can Google search anything. But if you don't know what to search,
Yeah.
you're lost.
Well, I wonder, in that, one of the big differences between the kind of platforms that you've been referring to and a project like the Offer Need Machine is that it's being conceived of and built by artists and cultural workers. And it's still in a very prototype stage, and you're still so many ideas are still floating around for it. But is that like, what are the strengths and sort of weaknesses of this idea? Because on one hand, it feels like, particularly within the media arts, we have always been adapting as artists, right? We have always been using commercial and industrial tools to try to figure out how we can adapt them to an artistic end. And is that actually a really important thing, or how do you see those strengths and weaknesses between?
And that was the one thing that I kept realizing. That's why I think it was like important for me to mention, like I was doing like on the side, like conversation consultant, like, okay, how do you do a live stream on IG? Or a painter, how can people view my work? And then it was one of those things that's like, if we're going to build a platform, which we made sure when we like did like some of our testing and that, they cannot all be media artists. We need writers involved. We need actors, because their needs are going to be dramatically different than what a media artist is. Because for me, I can just play platform to platform. That doesn't bug me. Like I never used OBS as much as I did during pandemic, but it's just another tool that like, okay, once you go and play around, but that's because of the art form that I'm part of. Now let's imagine the art form that other people in. If you're a painter, normally, like this might be like an overgeneralization, so if anyone's listening, sorry, you know, you choose your paint colors, right? Like you go to your tin, I know I'm going to use this hues, but remember with paint, unlike drawing, you can mix colors, right? Like that's the first thing. Like, yo, okay, if there's no baby blue, as a painter, if you paint it enough, okay, if I have blue and white, I can make baby blue. If you're a graphic designer, you know your hex codes. But that's one thing that like was the problem with getting like making a platform. All that, you have to realize that what is the innate knowledge or perceived like presumptions of certain people. And like let's say you go on, like I have people tell me they don't like Twitter. And why don't they like Twitter? And I know we're getting a bit technical, but I think it is. They're like 280 characters. I cannot write a long blog. So
Yeah.
when you're making a platform, it's like sometimes you can implicitly make people think a certain way. So like if you like, let's say you have a course. So how do we do this in the real world? Like, well, academic is a real world, but it's also its own world. So let's take academic. A course syllabus tells you how. A course syllabus sets the tone. So it's not only, oh, this assignment is due week 1, week 2. It's also what words are the teacher using to describe certain things. Is there leniency? Is it strict? Like there's a tone written. And
A kind of
online,
framework that you're setting for what you want to
yeah,
happen inside. Well,
exactly.
I wonder if that leads into another question that I have about growth and scale. That a lot of what the project, the O&M project, has been trying to focus on is how do we build trust in order to foster care and generosity. Trust is this really key component. So how do you set that framework within the platform design?
And that's what's actually one of the most interesting parts of the exhibition of not exhibition of the external test, like test subjects, because we did interview people, we talked to people, because at first we're like, maybe people will trust if you had a one-on-one with someone, but in reality, when you think about it, people actually trust you more if they see how you react in a room of like-minded people. Think about why people like going to webinars and conference. Most of the time you're going to a webinar not to do a one-on-one, because it's like there is an implicit trust that if I go to a conference, let's say on media arts, I am more than likely going to meet other people in media arts that might have more or less experience that I can trust and maybe sometimes validate some of my concerns, and maybe I might learn something there and there. When you go online, sometimes you don't have that trust because there's trolls, there's people that deceit, because not everyone shows their card. So this was one of the things, like, the problem with, and then when we go back to art form, actors, singers, how do you make something that like corresponds? So talking to people is like one of those things that, like, if we have a care protocol so everyone knows about terms of service, and one of the more popular code of conducts, which is similar to a TOS in a way, like there's difference, like term of services, those things that when you download an app, you're like, read through. But code of conducts are usually shorter but more concise. And a lot of people use the Berlin Code of Conduct, which is a very solid one. We're like, maybe we can make a twist. Maybe we can make a protocol for artist care. Because one thing, like, if you think about the stereotypes and myths about artists, starving artists, having to work all the time, isolated, lonely, not making money. It seems like if you think about all those words, the common thing is like malpractice or malnutrition in how they're able to feed their soul. So what about if we have a platform that it's not about getting the most likes, it's not about being the loudest, it's about internal care, something that if you want to receive something, the person that is going to give you the gift will go in. Like, think about Secret Santa for a bit. Like, that's how, like, when we're talking about it, it's like Secret Santa. Why does Secret Santa work so much? Because Secret Santa, you're not trying to outspend anyone. It's not about outspending. You're trying to get the right gift for someone by listening to them. So have you realized, I realized that in most Secret Santas, people get happy with those gifts. And, it's not, you like, $5, $10, $25. And usually those are the gifts, like, you remember the rest of your life sometimes, because you're like, wow, someone
You've
really
been
taught
involved
it
in
through.
some great Secret Santa exchanges, apparently.
Yeah. But
well, I think so. Then what you're touching on there, this idea of like this question of scale, right? How, so like, and also time. So like, how do you bring people into that condition? And because you're also kind of putting something forward around not having the same feedback mechanisms, right? You like saying like, well, it's not a question of likes or a question of exposure, but what feedback mechanisms do you think work in that context, and how and at what scale do they function best?
think it more like a natural pay it forward. Like, like, okay, I'm willing to give advice, I'm willing to give support, I'm willing to listen to you, because everyone can benefit from talking to someone. And that was one of the things that we were thinking of. It's like, okay, what is a good time scale? Because because one thing that a lot of people are saying, and if you do a lot of research, a lot of organizations, they claim like, okay, the superstar volunteer, like that one person that carries the load at times. Once that person leaves, some organizations crumble. We see it in schools, we see it in sports teams, we see it. So we're like, how do we negate that superstar feeling that everyone feels they have a role, but it doesn't burn anyone out? So one question we started asking is, if we can get like-minded individuals to understand under this care protocol that an hour, what is an hour worth? And most people tell you, oh, an hour is worth $10, $20. But then when you talk to other people, it's like an hour is just worth that I'm able to get my question answered, or I'm able to have a conversation that just makes me feel better. Because now let's say we take that hour. So right there, it's like, it's not capitalism that we're basing the hour on. And it's not even socialism. It's not even communism. It's not none of like the isms. Let's say that hour is based on a mood and experience.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that we naturally do this. We just don't realize. When you listen to your favorite album, you're setting a mood. So in that hour, you're setting a tendency. If you want to binge watch a show, those hours that you're binging, is it because of money? Sometimes it's really because in that hour you needed a certain mood. So you're trying to pay for a mood.
But there's an interesting connection there. I mean, you mentioned the isms, and obviously the hour as a unit of pay is very tightly tied to this, to that, billing and contracting. Did you guys explore other units? Because I think that unit of time is really interesting, to maybe use it as a symbol of the thing that you're trying to undermine. But did you guys talk about other units or other ways to think about that time?
So we're like, what do you value? So one thing is in that, like, one question we kept asking people and kept asking ourselves, what were the best mentorships you had? What were the best experiences working on a team? What moods? Like, some people are like, oh, I really appreciate honesty. So it's like one of those things that you're like, if people value different stuff, can it be an equal equation? There's like something called fairness model. So let's say you're hungry and I'm not that hungry, and we both bought a slice of pizza. If you eat 7 slices and I eat 3, that might not be equal. But if you're hungry and I'm not hungry, then that makes it more fair. And that's the one thing. It's like this hour. So one thing that we try to play with the hour is that the hour is not based on the person given.
So that it's more, there's sort of, it's based on the need.
Yes. On the
Okay.
need, because then you reframe the hour, right? Because now if we're gonna talk about the unit, now that hour we're putting a weighted sum on the receiver, in the sense that, but in a try to do it like, but since we added the care protocol in the beginning, now that sum is not a heavy burden. It's more like I'm in a space that maybe my needs would be respected. So now we change the formula from like an hour must equal that employee or employer both have to be satisfied with this in the contract. Now it's like within an hour, person out of their heart or like out of goodness provides X, Y, and Z information, let's say, to person, and said person is satisfied and happy. That's experience. So if the person receiving is sad or whatnot, we did not do our job.
Yeah. And have you thought, like, did the discussion revolve at all around looking at types of exchange that were in this realm? So like, certain kinds of care are certain kinds of are exchange that needed, but maybe like you said, information is another category. Basically like a skill of something, like someone who is, does it come down to something like accounting and bartering, but also mentoring and counseling? Like, how have you thought about these different ways that people might exchange this unit?
Well, I actually have taught that with swim tax. So there's something that we were doing on, like, in the Anti-Airbnb experience, the randomness. We were thinking like, okay, the random experience, how do you get that? Oh, there's one thing called like a knowledge circle. So one unit before I did O&M, I was thinking about knowledge circles. So I was like, okay, if we have an hour or such unit where one person teaches one week and another person teaches the other week, and then by the end, everyone would have skills in something else and taught. That's also one exchange thing, knowledge exchange. And then there's something, I think many cultures have this, but I'm going to speak from like the West African mindset. There's something called susu. So susu will be like, okay, 1 month, everyone gives $100. the person uses all, and then the next month we all like someone like receives all the $100 in a group, and then by the end everyone has gave the same amount but received the same amount.
Mm.
So in the end, hopefully the idea is that hopefully in the end, give and take.
Mm-hmm.
So and then so like you can play that with knowledge. So as artists, and this is where the tricky part comes in. As artists, we might have different wants and different needs. So if we have different wants and different needs, then how do we make that fair? Because remember that pizza thing that I told you. If you have 7 slices while you're hungry, and I have 3 slices while I'm not hungry, it's
Mm-hmm.
not equal, but it's more fair. So it's one of those things that
Yeah.
like, let's say we
That's
were
an
both
interesting
hungry.
parsing out those two ideas and how you incorporate that into a system, fairness and equality in a sense of like quantitative equality versus say, the qualitative is maybe more about fairness, about
It's,
thinking through these different
yeah.
values. So there in some ways, do you see it as trying to build a system that has almost two phases? Like there's the phase of being of moving into the system, of figuring out how you fit into these care protocols, and then the actual activation of the system, of how
Yeah.
you do this exchange and how.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then like I said, because it like I want to go back to the susu. A lot of people have bad experiences because at times you can call it fraud. Like some people have called fraud because I think you understand. Like if everyone gives you one and you run away, you everyone just lost the money at one shot.
Mm,
But there's a lot of other people that will tell you, no, no, it works because it's something that has been passed down generation to generation. Like this is not a new concept; it's done in centuries. So you have the good experience and the bad, and what does that come to? Your trust level right away.
mm-hmm.
Then it's that, so, and then of course putting money directly affects people, of course, which we're not gonna lie. Like if I give you $200 and you ran away right now, I'll probably be mad.
But and does
But
that relate back to that question of scale in terms of size? Like, if you're doing this in a small community where you actually see each other, it's pretty hard for you to like find the willpower to dupe people. But
it's yeah,
obviously, if you have a large scale anonymous structure, it's sort of easier to perpetrate kind of fraud within a system or question.
yeah,
Or is
exactly.
it just a
And
question that we're overly anxious about that? Is that actually not as much of an issue as it is?
but yeah, that's the thing though. But a lot of things that we have to do have to be care, right? So it's like that's why I laugh at what you just said. That's why I laugh at that notion sometimes. Like I understand when people say self-made, but the thing is that to be a self-made millionaire, to be a self-made artist and all that, you still needed someone to co-sign you, right? Like it's one of those weird concepts that like regardless of everything we do, we're such social creatures that sometimes we need a co-sign. And I don't mean a validation because
Mm-hmm.
there's a difference. I mean like unfortunately how our society works is like you cannot call yourself maybe something unless someone sees it, right? Like if you ever do grants, if you ever want to like
Well,
if you
there's
want to be
always
a
an
doctor.
ecosystem around us, whether that
Exactly.
ecosystem, even just at the base, natural or nurturing level of feeding and clothing us, we are not and never are individuals. We are, beings within a larger system. And do you think of the ecosystem as something, as a metaphor and a way of talking about what you're trying to do, maybe even more than a
100%.
platform?
100%, because if I'm not mistaken, like the project was also a form of like how mushrooms grow, that whole network, and fungus growing. It's one of the most interesting things to me, like how insects make their colonies. Because like we're saying, like insects are not as smart as stuff, but the way they grow, they just grow and then they survive and then they base off thing, right? Like I think it's one of those things that like if you kill an ant or like a spot or like a spider, they give off a scent so the other ones like naturally know what occurs. Or even like that whole thing that like if I'm eating honey, that honey came from a bee, which came from a plant, which came from a traveling bird's pollinated seed. Like we're all part of this pollination. So maybe the idea of what we're trying to do is that instead of trying to do like those grandiose things on the scale, maybe it's like the ultimate scale back in a way when you think about it, that what we're really trying to do is we're not trying to give you the truckloads of fruits because that has the logistics, that has that. Maybe it's just like building off that pollination. Because before you could even think the fruits, there's an ecosystem that started the pollination, right? Like bees going in. And then like a random fact that I'm gonna go in is that there's like this math thing called the nearest salesman. It's like, okay, how efficiently can you go from place to place? So you know, like UPS and all that, they go from like when they deliver house to house. A lot of people don't know that bees naturally can like almost solve that problem, right? Because think about it. If you're a bee, you're small, you're going to like these flowers, think of them as houses. You have to suck it, go in. So you're trying to naturally, and we don't think about that because we're not in that process. So it's one of those things that like maybe having a process that's built in just pollinating, germinating, like ferment things, maybe that process can lead have a bigger effect. So maybe we're just trying to build like maybe O&M is similar to that flower, that pollen, that just by pollinating other flowers, once you leave that ecosystem, maybe by the way you're paying it forward will help your community blossom into a flower, right? So that what bees and birds do, right? Pollinate that, go in. So it's one of those things, like I think you said the right word, ecosystem.
Well,
Like platforms are ecosystems.
do you think in that way, like that, sort of bringing the question of the digital back into it, is the work of the O&M as you move forward into this, like deeper into this prototyping stage, do you think the work that you're trying to do fits well into the realm of the digital? Is the digital a problem that needs to be sort of solved, or is there something inherent in the way digital technology is working right now in platforms that actually is very well suited to the O&M?
Oh, I think it's a mix of both. I think it's one of those things that since we're dealing with a lot of cultural things in mind, that we have to like, since we're dealing with care protocol, is that we're actually trying to make people, right? So no matter, and because there are a lot of digital things that are like you're more of a user, but in this case you're not a user, you're being part of this. Like that's why I think the pollination idea is good. That pollination, the fungus, like things that just go on. Like sometimes we have this romanticism that we have the next big idea, which maybe you do, maybe you don't, right? Like how we always, that saying like, oh, okay, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, or because of this. So, like, when you ever like look at the greatest Canadian invention might be the sipper, and you're like, how? And then you're like, huh, it has so many different things. So maybe it's one of those things that like the grandiose ideas or the big ideas that we're having when we're going on platforms. Maybe if we just bring it back to a human scale, because that if you have like when you look at some of these like term of services and all that, it talks about like users big scale, but maybe the care protocol, since we're bringing it back to like no matter how many people, that protocol brings it to one person. Like you are a person, we care. Like if you follow these steps or don't follow, this is how it's about, and that changes your mind. Like it's like I'm gonna give a bad example, but I remember I had a basketball coach and he was saying sometimes people cut themselves because sometimes you set the tone of the team that people realize that is not for them. So they find like some people find ways to self-sabotage or self this and that. But what if you have a care protocol? What is there to self-sabotage in a way, right? Like if you're trolling, you're actually affecting you, you're not affecting others. So maybe you come in, maybe you want to troll, maybe you don't believe. But since we set these protocols, if you're not a fit, it might show easily, might not. Like it depends. People are actors, and maybe trolls. Not all trolls are bad. Maybe that's something that we might figure out. Maybe like sometimes you're just trolling based on what you have read somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it sounds like you're also reckoning with the challenge of how you define, and maybe participant is a better word than user for the O&M. That is this right for you? That the care protocols that you're trying to build as an entryway into the platform are as much about defining behavior as as defining, and identifying, you're seeing yourself within this. This is for me. I actually want to participate in this generous exchange, and I want to participate in a system of care. And so you sort of are self-selecting. You're kind of defining the type of user that you want to participate.
Yeah, like that's why, right? Like when you see work culture, this and that, and sometimes the thing is that internet culture sometimes spread in, but for as bad as it has been, and there's a lot of things that go wrong, there's been a lot of good, right? Like, sometimes GoFundMe campaigns, or when we see that story, like someone just got accepted into grad school, and then strangers are taking care of you, and unfortunately there's been death in your family, and you see strangers out of nowhere comfort you, like, oh, I've been through this, don't worry.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been instances that humanity is not bad. It's just that sometimes we don't gather all of that. So maybe it's like, well, maybe it's one of those things that maybe we can infuse more care, maybe we'll get to going on. Because for, like I said, as bad as the internet has been, there's been, like, I don't know if that's many good things, because what is good, right? And relatively, what is good or bad? And I think
Yeah.
that's one thing, like when we're thinking about O&M, it's one of those things that, like, what will make most recipients good? Because those gifts, like there's like, I don't think I have this in my circle, but there's like, you hear those stories that, like, where someone's like, yo, someone just gave me this gift, but it's not really what I wanted. It's like they don't listen. That is a horrible user experience. That's a horrible user experience. So how do we prevent that user experience? How do we prevent
Mm-hmm.
those experiences from arising, from coming to life? But you can't please everyone too, right? Because statistically, that's
No, I
impossible.
think it
Like
needs to be a work in progress. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but what if you let someone know that it is a work in progress? Like, what if you, like, this care thing, because care is like, let's say care is a lifelong evolutionary process.
Yeah.
Does that change how you approach it? Maybe, probably, and that's probably one of the things we have to, like, try to find out.
So I wonder if we can still talk a bit more about the digital, and maybe how the digital has changed, how you've seen change both in artistic creation and arts organizations. How has that element changed over this year, and how has that changed? You can maybe start with the O&M machine, but maybe it's larger than that for you.
I will say scalability and imposter syndrome and celebrity status. So why do I mean scalability? A lot of organizations now are getting more people from outside the region, right? Like before, you had to think like, oh, you had to feel bad. Okay, we can't accept international artists. We can't accept people from other provinces because we have to pay for the lodging, blah, blah. That's where the whole webinar thing comes in, because now we're like, okay, we can find people of similar interests, similar stuff. So things have to be scaled bigger. But at the same time, while some things are getting bigger, some festivals have to get smaller to try to make that intimate, but also you're competing. Because now there's like a lot of stuff going on. Like, let's say you were in a city that there was 10 events going on for your particular thing per month. Now, since everyone has moved online or hybrid, that 10 moved to like 1,000. So now what? Now you're almost going in, and that leads also into sometimes the imposter syndromes. Like, am I really good at what I do? Do I have the followers? Do I have the likes?
Mm.
How come no one is paying this and that? So it's one of the things that, like, it has good scalability, but with that scalability, you start realizing your strengths and your cons. And some people are able to ride. Like, it's one thing, I guess, not to, like, mistake like that if you have a lot of followers that means that person is great, or vice versa. I think
So
that's one of the most important things
part of what you're
to
saying
do.
there is an erosion of the local, is what you're seeing.
It,
Like
yeah.
there's really uh, your sense as a creator. This combination is partially because no longer are you being measured only in relation to the or the weight of your local impact of being part of a community has actually been eroded, because now everything is global all of a sudden, and so big has gotten bigger, and the long tail has gotten much more difficult to navigate.
But also, I think also with that, like some things that were niche, because I know niche is not really local, but there's also like, I think the concept of niche becomes like shot up, right?
Yeah.
And the thing, like, and there's good and bad on that, because you don't want to be a gatekeeper, and I think gatekeeping is wrong. I think that like if people want to go in, but then also you start getting sidesteps. So it's like, and this is why I think that like as digital artists and media artists, sometimes we might be like problematic with this, right? When you think about it. Like, let's say as a media artist, I don't know anything about this, but since I can code it, it will work.
We just have a little glitch. It's because Callie has got the same interview. She's our interview this afternoon. So.
No problem. I don't know.
Was probably just testing out something.
Was that long enough though? I don't mind. I think that was a good convo. Or there's more you wanted to talk about, or was it good?
Well, we can. What we'll do is, if you want, you can kick Callie out. She might hear us say that. There we go. And then we'll take that. We'll go back and take this question again. I think we were talking about what were we talking about just before Callie came in? The digital and arts organizations, the local erosion of the local.
Erosion
you were sort of saying the good and bad of that. I think we're hitting into the 40+ minute mark, so our brains are probably starting to wear out for a conversation. So what we can do is we'll take a kind of we'll take a step back, and then we'll maybe try and wrap up with a final question. What do you think?
Up to you.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah, we can go on final question now, and then let me know how it is. And
yeah, what do you think? That sound good? Okay, so we'll cut ourselves in again in 5, 4, 3, 2. So we were talking about this idea of the way that the erosion of the local can have sort of good and bad. And you were talking about gatekeepers and the idea of inclusion, I think. Do you want to touch back on those things?
Yeah, because I just feel like the problem is that it's easy to assimilate into different formats right now. Because like you said, like if you're a teacher, you're making a YouTube channel, but for some people, like, are you doing the proper, like if you do photography, you have the proper thirds or whatnot. Some niches don't mind, some niches do. And that's the problem with like this global thing, is that problem and not problem is that it brings shine. Like right now, I know I've been plugging like so many different platforms. Like the other day I was watching a documentary on like yo-yoing and fantasy hairstyling. And in my head, I'm like, yo, damn, yo-yo is a big community, and fantasy hairstyling. How do you get into that? How do you get into that professionally? But then when you think about how do we get into other stuff professionally, by watching that documentary, I think I actually watched like more yo-yo videos that I have watched since I posted probably like 10, 11. And maybe even then, I didn't even watch that many because, I didn't have that access to. So by watching that documentary, others people might get into yo-yoing. But then you get into yo-yo, and it's like, are you in it for the tricks? Are you in it for the fundamentals, right? Because it's a niche thing. So sometimes it's like people might gatekeep. And I'm not saying gatekeeping is right, because I think that we should be open, but I think that you should also let people know about how your system works or how your care works and all that. So I think that is one thing I was trying to emulate, that the thing with the scalability is that things are becoming more known, so more people can interact. You're not having that sense of like you're lonely or that you're just a few that do it, But then at the backside, it's like sometimes things can wash away. Like, when you were asking before, like if some platforms change dramatically by how many people use them, right? Like we're on Zoom right now, but like Zoom fatigue really is because everyone used Zoom for everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so it's one of those things. It's like, okay, do we get fatigue from our own niches? Do we get scalability? How do we make sure that as things get larger, it's harder for organizations to keep track of everyone? So once you do this international outreach or this globalization, should say, how do you make sure that like even people that like don't feel like they have a say in the organization are still part of it? So
as we wind down our conversation, maybe we can touch quickly on what's next for you and what's happening right now. I know you're in the next phase of prototyping for the O&M. You'll be a part of that. Is there other stuff that you're working on that you want to talk about?
I've been working on census. So the whole local idea has been something on like, how do I make things feel local and niche? So I've been making, like, I just released, this is like shameless plug, I just released like an album called Colorscape where every track I code based on the color value. So the title, like let's say the title is the baby blue. So let's say like 010101. Any number you found in that hex file, I will make a track. So it's like an internal monologue. But now the more I think about it, I'm like, oh, if I can miss, maybe I can miss taste. So one thing is like, how food is like, some food have colors. So orange, like chocolate. So maybe I could do something where I make a representation of like the sounds to get people to think about taste and smell, and then do all that. Because that's one thing I realized the more I do online stuff, that I really want to play with people's senses and emotion and connection. But then I'm like, what is the easiest way to do it without an algorithm do it? What is the human way? And I'm like, oh, cue cards are just say random words. Because like you like so one example for that, when you wake up in the morning, depending on what you hear the weather's gonna be, might change your output. So if it's cold, you're probably drinking hot chocolate maybe. If it's summer, you're probably not drinking as much. So try to play with those little variables online to make that connection. So yeah.
So
I'm
you
trying to do more of
keep
those things.
working in this format in the audiovisual album. That's something you really enjoyed.
It was fun, but also I'm thinking about like, let's say we're back in person. So one thing is like that audiovisual thing is like, let's say like there's a room that has different colors, and based on the color you're listening to, you go to that color. Because I want to bring that hybrid back. So how like everyone's moving to digitization. I want to have stuff that could live on a digital space, but if we're physically with each other, they can still be emulated in a different experience. So something that's both static and dynamic at the same time.
Cool.
And
Well,
also using cell
thanks
phones.
very much for your time today.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to seeing what comes next, both with the O&M and your own stuff.
Thank
And
you very much.
take care.
Thank you.